What's better than a space marine? A space shark. Hi guys, Jonathan from Two Raven Studios. Today I have another painting tutorial from you. If you're new, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have a lot of cool content, new painting videos every week and you don't want to miss out. Today what we're going to paint is some Primaris Carcharodon Space Marines. So I love the look of Phobos armor and I wanted to paint a Vanguard army because of that. I wanted something beaten up and worn looking and I figured these are the type of Marines that are perfect for that. I also didn't want to do a first founding chapter, I wanted to do something a little different. So I went for the Carcharodons Astra, or as they're also known in Low Gothic, the Space Sharks. So that's what I'm going to call them from now on, is just Space Sharks because it's easier to say and it's more fun. So what we're going to do is paint some beaten up armor. They have gray power armor, so it's going to be beaten up gray armor, but as I always say, you can apply what I'm doing to anything you're doing. I'm here to give you ideas, not to tell you exactly how to paint. The other thing is we're going to be using some Eliminators, which are not the most Space Sharky type of Marines. They're snipers, and you know the Space Sharks are aggressive in your face. But Games Workshop's distribution is limited right now, and this is what I could get my hands on. But it's pretty cool because they have camo cloaks, and I'm going to paint the camo cloaks like old beaten up leather. So not only are we going to learn how to paint beaten up armor, we're going to learn how to paint some weathered leather as well. So, we have a lot of painting ahead of us. Let's hop right into it. If you've watched most of my videos, I almost always do a zenithal prime on my miniatures, and this is how I do it. I figured it's about time I showed it. It's primed with Vallejo black surface primer, and now I'm going in with titanium white ink from the high angle. I like using ink for my zenithal highlights because you can get a much smoother finish. If you don't have an airbrush, you could do the same thing with rattle cans. It just wouldn't give you as smooth a gradient, which when we're doing worn work like this, it actually might be a better thing to have it not as worn. I just wanted to show you here, this is how I'm going to be using the airbrush in the next step. You put the pressure down for the air, and I kind of paint comes off and on because we want the paint to dry as it's hitting the surface. So what we're going to be using is Basilicanum Gray here, and this is going to be the main color of the armor. If you look at the angle I'm spraying from, I'm trying to go straight into the miniature. That way the overspray will get the top parts of the miniature, but it will still be lighter and leave some of the white showing, give us some natural highlights. So I decided once this step was over that wasn't as much highlights as I wanted, and I kind of changed gears, but that's kind of the concept of what I'm doing right now, spraying from an angle that still gives me highlights. And again, that pressure that I was talking about where we put air and off and on, it's very important with this Basilicanum Gray I found in particular because it likes to run if you spray too much, so you want to make sure it dries by alternating paint, air, paint, air, paint, air as you're spraying. So now what I'm doing is I'm going in with both Gorgrunta Fur and Snakebite Leather with a brush, and as you can see I have both paints open, so I have them in a well out of frame, and I'm kind of randomly putting them in different areas and wet blending them together before they dry, because you have plenty of time. The way you're putting this on, it's not going to dry right away. So I am mainly putting the Gorgrunta Fur in areas more recessed and the Snakebite Leather in more raised areas, but it's not a strict rule. I'm trying to make this look blotchy. These big surfaces with this contrast paint, it probably will dry somewhat blotchy, but that's what I want because I want to start getting texture of this worn leather, and this is how I'm doing it. So now we're switching back over to the airbrush, and I'm using Wildwood contrast paint. This is undiluted through the airbrush. This is going to be a shade for everything. So both the armor and the leather are getting this color as a shade. It's why I painted the leather in before I did this step. So you're going from a low angle, because it's the opposite of what we were doing earlier, how we're going from a high angle. We're going from a low angle and trying to catch all the shadows and recesses with this color. So just move around, spraying, still with that back and forth finger motion to get the alternating paint, air, paint, air. Next, I'm highlighting the armor with the Crixbane highlight. As you can probably see, I have not masked anything off. I very, very rarely ever mask anything when I'm airbrushing. I just try to use control and the angle that I'm spraying so I don't get too much overspray. The leather's going to be worn, so if we get a little bit, it's not the end of the world, but I'm trying to control short bursts from high angles just on the armor itself with this Crixbane highlight. It is thinned down with Vallejo Airbrush Flow Improver, and we're just taking this angle and spraying highlights on the armor. I decided that I want the highlights even brighter, so I added some titanium white ink right into the pot of Crixbane highlight and just repeated the process on focusing on smaller areas, making the highlights even brighter. This next step, I used bootstrap leather thinned down with Vallejo Airbrush Flow Improver to add highlights to the leather. I probably would have skipped this step if I would to redo this, but I had done it here. But again, you can skip this step if you want to. It's not necessary. Next up, we're rapid firing a bunch of base coats. First up is bolter casing and anything else you want to be black. A mix of black Templar and Thamar black to help it flow into the crevices. Just anything that's going to be black is this color. Next up, all the silver parts are black metal by scale 75. So this is mostly parts of the gun and that sort of thing. Next base coat is a mix of Gore-Grunta fur and Cygor brown contrast. This is an all the leather straps on them, so just give them a slightly different color than the leather we've already painted. Our last base coat is Decayed Metal from scale 75, and it's going to go on all the skull emblems, which is just the chest and the gun on these guys. So before we do all the weathering, I want to add the freehand to the shoulder pad of the chapter logo. So I'm starting out with Thrall Flesh here, and I'm going to talk through the basics of how I freehand stuff. So I'm just drawing the basic shape. If you don't know, the Carcharodons chapter symbol is a shark shaped like a crescent. So I'm just drawing that crescent. One of the key things to remember when you're trying to paint fine detail is the direction that you're painting. So as you drag the brush, the finer point of the paint should be at the end of your stroke. So when you're trying to get like the fine tips of the fins, you want to paint towards the end of the fin as you're painting. So you can just watch me move around here. The key to this is to keep the paint thin, and it doesn't have to be perfect. We can keep refining it until we get what we want, as long as that paint is thin. So you can kind of see. You also might have noticed I switched over to a different model in the unit. This one just had the most accessible shoulder pad, so it was the easiest to show painting this detail. So I'm just trying to get the basic shape of the shark right now. Not concerned if it's perfect, just trying to get the basic concept. Once I have the basic concept there, I go in with Thamar Black to refine the edges. So you can really sharpen up the points of the fins. Anything you need to reshape you can do here. But again, you want to keep this paint thin. As long as your paint is thin, you can keep going back and forth between this step and the previous step until you're happy with the shape. The key to freehand is to really just realize you have to play with it to get the shape you want and not expect to be perfect on the first try. Now that I'm pretty happy with the shape, I'm just going to go in with Sickly Skin, which is an almost white color, and just kind of go over the shape again and add some highlights and distressing to it. So I'm going over almost everything I painted previously. I'm just leaving a little bit of the thrall flesh showing so it looks a little distressed, but we're going to really add to that when we get to the weathering step. The last thing I want to do before weathering is painting the skin. Space sharks are supposed to have a pale, almost white skin, so I'm starting with Troll Blood Highlight, which is a warm, light gray color. So just base coat the skin in this color. Next up, I'm going to wash the skin in a mix of Magos Purple and Guilliman Flesh contrast paint. It's thinned down slightly, and you just want to tint the recesses of the miniature with this color. Next, we're going to go back in with highlights, first with our original color of Troll Blood Highlight, and then adding some Sickly Skin into that color just to pop the highlights out. Once this is finished, I'm also going to paint the eyes. Carcharodons have dark black eyes with pretty much just pure black, so I just used some Black Templar recess into the sockets of the eyes to do that. Alright, one last thing before we get in with the real weathering. We're going to dry brush bootstrap leather onto the leather parts. This is why I said you could have skipped the airbrushing earlier. You could just dry brush it and don't even have to worry about airbrushing on the highlights of this color. Just the dry brush is fine by itself. Alright, if you watched my video earlier this week, oil paints. So I have burnt sienna, some ivory black, and in the middle I have a mixture of the two. It's thinned down with mineral spirits. If you want more information about oil paints, I will link the video from earlier in this week about it in detail. But what I'm going to do is use that mix of the ivory black and burnt sienna to panel line most of the armor. So I'm just washing. You can kind of see as I tap, it flows into the recesses of the armor. The oil paints is really going to help us give this armor a nice weathered look. So as I'm moving around the miniature, all of the armor is going to get burnt sienna as a wash on it to darken it. The leather parts are actually going to get the pure black as well as the metal there on the chest. So the metals on the chest and the leather parts are going to get the pure black thinned down, and then the parts that are black are going to actually get the pure burnt sienna, because we can't make the black darker, but we can make it look rusty and dirty, and that's what we're going to use the burnt sienna for. So anything that's actually black, as you can see the gun casing here, we're going to use some burnt sienna to make it look very dirty and dingy. So the main way we're using this is thinned down as these washes. But if you watched my video earlier in the week, you know there's far more we can do with oil paints, and we're going to do that too. So using our mix, we're going to actually draw dots and lines. So the mix is going to be dots and lines on the armor. On the leather itself, you're going to use the black to do the same thing, draw dots and lines. So you can kind of see here, I'm starting to add some lines and weathering in on this leg right here. I'm going to do the same thing on the leather with the ivory black. You can actually use a little bit of the ivory black on the freehand we drew to make that look a little weathered too. So oil paints, you know I love them. That's going to be the main first step of the weathering here. You can also use some of the pure burnt sienna on the gray armor to make it some rust and dirt look on it. But again, here if you look, I'm drawing lines with a slightly thicker version of the paint. I talked about how I did that in this week's earlier video. Now that we darken the armor down, we have to brighten it back up. So we're going to use Crixbane Highlight, our original color that we did on the highlights, to brighten things back up. So the first thing you're going to do is edge highlight the tops of all the panels, but you're not going to draw straight lines. If you know, I like to kind of stipple and dot along the edges for my edge highlights because it makes it look nice and worn. So as you move around, you can kind of see I'm just dotting as I move along the edge of the panel to highlight it. The other thing you're going to do with this is any of bigger dots or scratches you made with the darker oil paints, you're going to underline with this colors because it's going to give it the illusion that it's a deeper scratch by having the lighter color underneath the dark. You can also make scratches that don't have the darker color on top to simulate shallower scratches in the armor. And just random dots here and there too. Again, we're just trying to make this look as de-stressed as possible and old and worn. So just keep moving around with this, edge highlighting and adding in all the scratches and texture to that gray armor. We're going to repeat that process now, just mixing some sickly skin into the Crixbane highlight to give us a lighter color, and do the same exact thing. We just want to make sure we don't cover everything we just did with the Crixbane highlight. We want to highlight those highlights, so there should be a smaller surface area that it's covered. So again, we're going to do those dotted edge highlights. We can kind of dot some highlights into the scratches we drew with the pure Crixbane highlight. Just keep working until you're happy with the amount of weathering that the armor has. Next up, we're going to highlight the black bits. So we're going to do, again, those dotted edge highlights using Graveyard Denim, which is a light bluish gray color. So just moving around exactly what we did with the gray armor, just with this color now on the black parts. And then we're going to highlight those same areas with Troll Blood highlight. So just like we did with our second highlight on the armor, we want to make this cover a smaller area. So it's the same process, dotting those edge highlights on anything that is black on this miniature. Now we come what is probably the most time-consuming part of this miniature, which is highlighting the leather. So we're going to stipple on highlights along the edges, and also you can see underneath all those little scratches I drew. You can also stipple random areas to give it some texture. So if you don't know what stippling is, that means I'm just dotting the brush as I move along. You can also just draw random scratches. So everything we just did on the armor, you can do here on the leather to make it look old and worn. So we're just going to move around with this bootstrap leather and pretty much do the same thing we did on the power armor. Again, this is very time consuming because there's a lot of leather on this big cloak to cover. Second highlight is Beast Hide. And again, we're doing the same thing as we did with all the other areas, just same type of highlights over a smaller surface area. Just move around the miniature with this color now. Again, scratches, You can highlight some of the earlier scratches, highlight parts of whatever you want to be brighter, whatever you want to give texture to. Just move around and really make this look beaten and worn. Alright, I'm going to stick this here. You might notice there's more of the miniature painted, but at the end I was not happy with the leather. I wanted to give it even more detail, so I went in with Shyest Purple contrast paint and kind of did the opposite of what I was doing earlier. Now I'm dotting those stippling into the shadows, kind of adding some recessed areas over the highlights I've already done. The thing I'm really focusing on is the edge between those two pieces of the camo cloak to really give it separation. I just really wanted to give it a little bit more depth, so I used this Shyest Purple to do the same thing I was doing with the highlights, but just in the shadow areas. Alright, we're going to start highlighting the metal parts. So first, Moonstone Alchemy on anything that we had painted the bronze color earlier. So again, you can use the same techniques we've been using this whole time with the dotted stippled highlights to give you some nice worn bronze look. Next up is Thrash Metal on all the parts that were the more silvery type of gold. Again, same type of highlights here. With this color, I am also painting all the little buckles and buttons on them that I didn't paint earlier. Just get this color on it, so all the little buckles on the robe. I really like Scale 75 paints. If you haven't tried them out, I would highly suggest it. Their metallics are amazing, and it's primarily what I use for all my metallics. Alright, and last up is Speed Metal. Everything that's metallic, the bronze and the silver colors, are all getting this as a final small highlight. Just like we've been doing this entire time, our second highlight wants to cover less area than the first one did. This is optional, but I took some black paint and just painted all those little lines on the inside of the camo cloak, like the wires running down, with this Thamar black. Next up is the lens on the binocular. So this is the way I like to paint gem type stuff. We're going to start with a very bright green called Worm Green all over the lens. Once that's applied, now we're going to shade it. We're going to use Warp Lightning from Citadel, the contrast paint, to shade down the upper areas. When you're painting something that is like a lens or a gem, you want to actually shade the higher part of it darker, where the light is shining in from, and then the light shining out will make the lower area brighter. Once that's complete, we're going to use Dark Angel's Green and further darken those high areas. So you can go back and forth between these two colors and kind of blend them together, feather them out into our base color underneath until you're happy with the result. So this is something you're going to have to play with a little bit so you get the look you're going for. You can even go back to your base color of the Worm Green if you cover up too much of it, but just move around with this color and kind of play with it until you're happy with the look of the lens. Once you're happy with the lens, you can give it a dot of reflection with white, or in this case I'm using Sickly Skin, which is an off-white, and then do the same thing in the lower corner. You kind of want to give it a nice little edge highlight so it's like the light shining through the lens there at the bottom. It's really what gives it that look of it being a lens and not just painted, is having those bright small highlights. You don't want to overdo this, just little small area. Again, play with it until you're happy. And now we're going to repeat the same process on the scope and the lenses on his little thing on his head. We're going to start with Khador Red Highlight, which is actually orange if you're unfamiliar with P3 paints. So we're just painting these with an orange to start. They're going to be red once we finish though. And our last steps is we're going to use Blood Angel Citadel Contrast just the way we use the Warp Lightning on the green. We're using this to make this red. And then we're going to further it with Flesh Terrors Red, just like we did with the Dark Angel's Green. So same thing we just did. Once this is done, you're going to want to dot the white highlights on it as well. So this is the finished unit. You can kind of take a look of all the work we put into these guys. I know I didn't paint the bases in this video, but that's going to be a separate video coming next week because this one's long enough already. So you can look forward to that coming up. But if you followed along, you kind of have a good idea of how to make these guys look like they've been out in the field for a while with their armors beaten up. They have their beaten up cloaks, and it looks nice and dirty and like worn warriors should. Here is a lieutenant that with the Reaver armor that I also painted with the same thing. This kind of gives you an idea of, without the cloak, how you can really go crazy on the armor itself with the weathering. So I just wanted to give you a look at the armor itself underneath the cloak if you weren't painting an Eliminator and just painting a regular Marine. But it's all the same techniques used on this guy, just without the cloak on top. So you really would focus more on the weathering of the armor in this case. So that was how to paint some sneaky space sharks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found it useful, please leave a like, give us a subscribe. If you have any comments, any questions, feel free to put them down below and I'll answer as best as I can. Until next time, keep on gaming and paint your minis.